star of stage and screen. But it's very inspiring, and we're so excited. And I can't believe, I said to Katie, I can't believe this is a debut novel because props.
It's so good. And can we wish Sam Gregory a happy birthday? Today is actually her birthday. And she has chosen to spend it with us.
Thank you, Katie's mom, for the cookies.
Oh, yes. Hi, everyone. So nice to see you here at Zibby's. I dressed for the occasion in honor of Anime Wong, and I got this, just so you know, in a shop 2 shops down called Bijou Indochine. So right there, she has a collection of vintage jackets. But anyway, I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with you tonight, Katie. When Sam first told me about this, I've always been intrigued by Anime Wong, but never really known too much about her. And she said, well, let me send you the book and check it out. And I was shocked by how thick this book is. But as I read it, I just came to understand just how prolific she was in Hollywood. So let's go back. As Sam mentioned, this is your first book. What motivated you to want to write your first book about Anime Wong?
I was really compelled to write this book. I think that Anime might have channeled me and said, like, hey, you're the one who's going to do this. But I first learned about Anime Wong 20 years ago when I was doing my first college internship at the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles. And my first day on the job, the curator took me on a tour of the exhibitions, and there was a bunch of photographs of Chinatown through the years. And one of them was a photograph of Anime Wong. And I didn't know who that was. And that photo, out of all the photos, really struck me. And I immediately asked, like, who's that woman? And she told me, well, her name's Anime Wong, and she was this internationally famous Chinese American movie star in the 1920s and 30s. And I couldn't believe that I'd never heard of her before. I mean, I'm half Chinese. I grew up in an Asian American community. My mom, who's here in the back, was born in Chinatown in Los Angeles, which I heard all of her stories about growing up there. And yeah, no one had ever
Did she know
told me
about Anime Wong?
I think that
Mom, did you know about
she
Anime
can
Wong?
verify. I think I went home and asked her
Before your daughter's deep
I think
dive.
I went home and asked her, and I remember her saying, her name sounds familiar. That sounds about right. Is that what you remember, Mom?
Probably had the grandparents.
So then I went onto Google and started seeing all these images of her, and I was just immediately obsessed, and also felt this sense of injustice that how could this woman who was so incredible and famous be completely forgotten? Like, people need to know about her. So that was 20 years ago. I went to college. I researched her a little bit in college, and then I moved to New York. I started working in book publishing. I worked on some other people's books, including Sam Wasson's book, 5th Avenue 5 a.m., which is about the making of Breakfast at Tiffany's, which gave me, the wheel started to turn in my head that maybe I could write about Anime Wong in this similar way. And, fast forward another decade, probably, the last 5 years have basically been dedicated to researching and writing her life. And I think part of it also was having read other biographies. I mean, there was a lot of information in them, but I felt that it was missing her as a person, and also what her experiences were like as an Asian American woman, which was something I'm very familiar with and I grew up with from my mother and my family's experiences and my friends. And that was something I wanted to embrace in this book.
What I also love about this book is not only is it a deep dive into who Anime Wong was, but it's also this very comprehensive exploration of the origins of Hollywood, how Los Angeles became the home to the industry. So can you talk about those parallels, like how Anime Wong even found herself witness to the development of Hollywood?
Right. I mean, that was one of the joys for me, is getting to do a deep dive into Los Angeles history. I grew up in the San Gabriel Valley, even though I've lived in New York for the last 15 years and missed California a great deal. And so it was fun to learn about the history, which most of us don't learn growing up here. And LA is not a very old city. So 100 years ago, 120 years ago, it was really like a Western outpost. And Anime Wong's family, people don't realize that not only was she American born, but her father was as well. So it was really her grandparents who immigrated from China around the gold rush. coming to California. So her father was born in a mining town in Northern California during the Wild Wild West days. So eventually he moved down to Los Angeles and opened up a Chinese, he was Chinese, not a Chinese laundry. He is Chinese, and he opened up a laundry. And so Anna May ended up being born in 1905 in Los Angeles. So she was in the right place at the right time, in that, when she was 5, you started having studios in New York. That's where movies really started, was in New York and New Jersey. They realized they could come to California. There was all this land. The weather was great. They could film all year, and they could go from the ocean to the mountains to downtown and make it look like any city in the US. So they moved here in 1910. And, as she's a kid helping out at her dad's laundry, making deliveries with her older sister, Lulu, she starts to see people just making movies in the streets. Because back then they didn't have to get, licenses or anything like that. And they liked shooting in Chinatown because it was free atmosphere, right? They didn't have to create any sets. They could just use the backdrop and it was ready to go. So she was one of the first, locals to start seeing that as a kid. But she had that vision for herself that once she understood what they were actually doing and she started going to the movies, she knew that was what she wanted to do.
Well, I also found it interesting because it was such a new industry.
Mm-hmm.
People like Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, they also came from very humble roots. So while Anime Wong, because of her ancestry, wasn't ever able to become a lead in the beginning, most of these actors, when Hollywood first was being developed, they also came from humble backgrounds as well. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So the early days of film were kind of like, if you think about Silicon Valley, or today with TikTok, people don't necessarily think of it as this high art thing. They think it's annoying, or they want it to go away. The films were like that when it started, because people came out here. There were people living here in Los Angeles, but in the country, and they had farms, and suddenly there were all these weirdos essentially who showed up and were wearing costumes and set up in barns and all sorts of things and filming, and it was very annoying to them, and people didn't respect it as an art. So in some sense, it was the barrier to entry was very low. Anyone who wanted to work in films probably could. You could just walk into a studio and say, hey, put me to work. And I mean, that's how D.W. Griffith, one of the famous directors, he started as an actor, I believe. And then eventually they're like, well, you want to try being a director? And turned out he was good at it. And so that was the way, I mean, so in a sense, early Hollywood was more open than it became in the 1930s. So people like Anime Wong, and there were actually quite a number of Asian Americans and Asians from Asia who were working in Hollywood at that time. And that kind of ended in the sound era, because basically people realized it was big business. So you have the people with money who come in and they change the industry and they control it more, and they push out some of those more independent and more diverse people.
I mean, it really was so experimental at that time for everyone, because it was such a new industry. How did Anime Wong's family feel about what she wanted to pursue?
Right. I think, it was always a negotiation with her family, as it is, I think, in most Asian families. Our parents have certain expectations for us, and we might have other ideas of what we want to do with our lives. Certainly, her parents weren't initially very welcoming to the idea. I mean, again, it was hard to explain to any American what movies were at that time. So to explain to Chinese parents what these movies are and why you want to be in them, and it was really difficult. And actors, again, were not in any culture, were not seen as a very
noble profession.
Exactly, not a noble profession. But once she was very persistent and stubborn, and no one could really tell her no. I mean, when she would go watch the movie, she would skip school to do it, and her not only would her Chinese teacher whip her, but so would her dad. And she was totally fine with that. And her dad would complain, I pay for your Chinese tutoring. Why don't you skip the other school that you don't that's free and go to Chinese school? But no, so there was a lot of back and forth about the films, but then, you know, she'd bring home these big checks and she'd give back to her family and help out with things. So it was hard to really argue when the money was coming in. So you see in like her early career in the 1920s, she's kind of going back and forth between living at home, you know, in her father's laundry, or moving out and living in Hollywood. But she was really close to her family and she wanted to be near them. And every time she moved away, she felt that she was pretending to be something she wasn't. So eventually they came to a compromise and he said, you know, if you come home, I'll build you your own bungalow in the back of the laundry and that will be yours. And, you know, that was kind of his way of saying like, look, I accept that you're going to be an actress. This is what you're doing.
But she would go do these jobs and then go back and work in the laundry most days.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, the biggest film of her early career that launched her, The Thief of Baghdad, was Douglas Fairbanks' kind of an Arabian Nights themed film where he gave her a very prominent role as the Mongol slave, probably the most unexpected breakout role. But, you know, and at that time she had already made enough money to buy herself a Studebaker, but she did not know how to drive it. And even when she did learn to drive, she was a notoriously terrible driver. She totaled a couple cars. But
Is that why the stereotype?
Yes.
Anime Wong?
I know, she started it.
Killed us.
Right. So she had this Studebaker and she couldn't drive it. So her good friend who lived down the street was Philip Ahn, who later became East Korean American. He became an actor. So he would drive her to work to the Fairbanks studio. And wait, what was the original question?
Well, just that she would go work in the laundry.
Right. So she'd be working on this massive, you know, $1 million set every day. And then she'd come home and basically clock in at the laundry and go back to bookkeeping or whatever else needed to do. And so she was always playing kind of dual roles in her films, but also in life.
Going back to her family a little bit, I know that her father was somewhat displeased at the kinds of roles she was given. Not surprisingly, but that caused kind of a rift in their relationship that persisted for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, he wanted his children to get married and to have traditional lives and to, you know, uphold a certain values that he had. And I think for Anna May, one of the reasons she never married, I think, was really because she wanted to be independent as a woman. And she saw the way her mother waited on her father, and it had been an arranged marriage. In fact, her mother was his second wife, and she was married probably around age 14. So she was very young. And yeah, Anna May said, like, I don't want that for my life. And, you know, so it's an interesting relationship because I think she deeply loved him. They deeply loved each other. They were in conflict a lot, but she always found a way to come home and to give back to her family. And in fact, I feel that had she not been so close to her family, she would not have, I mean, she probably could have just lived the rest of her days in London or Europe because it was a lot easier of a place for her to live and work. But because of that connection, she always came home to Los Angeles.
Yeah, the filial piety.
Yes, yeah.
Talk about her early roles. And the other thing that's just so surprising to me is just the agency that she had, her determination, her she wasn't like the perception, I think, of Asian women at that time. Was she an anomaly, do you think, in her boldness?
That's a great question. I mean, on some level, maybe she was an anomaly because she was such a rebel and she was so stubborn-minded. She was just, if she wanted to do something, she was going to do it and no one was going to stop her. But I do think that the stereotypes of Asian women are so strong that we just assume that all women hew to them, right? Yeah. So I'd like to believe that there were more people like her. I mean, and actually there were. I mean, a lot of them she was friends with, right?
Yeah.
There was, I don't know if you're familiar with, I believe her name was Mamie Louise Liang. She was the first Chinese American journalist. She worked for the Los Angeles Times. She interviewed Anime, was friends with her. Anime also later went on to make a film about, I think it's Margaret Chung, or I'm going to get her name wrong, but she was the first Chinese American doctor. And she made a film that was basically a fictional biopic of her called King of Chinatown. So there were a lot of other strong Asian women, but unfortunately we've kind of forgotten them to history. So yeah, I do want to believe that there were more people like Anime. Was there a second part to that question? I'm forgetting now.
No, just,
Okay.
I guess when I was reading it, I was kind of just blown away by her boldness.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't expecting someone at that time, just given the role that so many Asian Americans played, given the fact that my own grandparents were highly educated when they came to this country. In fact, my grandfather went to school. He went to NYU and University of Colorado to get his MBA. But when he immigrated to the United States in the late 40s, he couldn't get hired to work in finance because he was Chinese. And so they ended up opening a restaurant. And so as I'm reading about her and just again, like that boldness, it just seemed, it was one refreshing, but it sort of surprised me. And I didn't have a sense of whether that was whether she was an anomaly.
Right. And I mean, I feel that there were other women like, I mean, certainly there were other actresses also. I mean, there's another, someone who was in a number of films with her was Etta Lee. She was mixed race Asian, also trying to make a career as an actress. So there were certainly people who were doing similar work, but have not been remembered in the same way, or left the industry at a certain point. But now I'm remembering also you had asked about some of her early roles. Yeah, so she did have to play a lot of stereotypes. I mean, the film that got her the role in The Thief of Baghdad was Lotus Blossom, in a Madame Butterfly story where she falls in love with an American, and he basically knocks her up and then leaves and then comes back and says, "Hey, I'm married to this American woman now," and then she gives him the child and throws herself into the sea. So not a delightful story, but and also but and the funny thing is that you hear about all the stereotypes she plays, and that's true. But when you actually watch her performances, they really exceed your expectations, and she does so much with like so little. And the thing about The Toll of the Sea was actually the second Technicolor film ever made. So she's playing Lotus Blossom. This is a Madame Butterfly story that people had heard over and over. It had already been made with Mary Pickford and Norma Talmadge, so nobody was expecting this to be any good. But then her performance just wowed people, and the New York Times raved about it, saying, 9 out of 10 performances in this type of story are terrible, but hers is the 10th performance, and like she deserves to be seen more on screen. So even watching that film today, 100 years later, you just get such a sense of her power and her talent. So that's, I think, the interesting thing. And then, after she does Thief of Baghdad, she becomes internationally famous. So studios understand that if you put her name on a production, people will want to go see her. But then they start doing this whole thing where they're going to give her billing with the other top actors. But when you go to see the film, she's in it for 5 minutes. And usually playing like a floozy or a kind of evil, treacherous person, and who generally dies in the end or can't get the guy. And so after a while, she gets really fed up with that.
I mean, and that's the thing also that surprised me, is just how much critical praise she got as well, but yet still marginalized in the projects. Can you talk about her decision to go to Europe pretty early on in her career and how that changed the trajectory of her career?
Right. So as I mentioned, she gets fed up with Hollywood. This is 1927, 1928. And by this time, she's circulating with a very sophisticated crowd in Hollywood, like not the normal actors, but people who like to read and who love art, and a lot of Germans and British expats who find themselves in Hollywood. And one of them, Karl Vommler, is kind of this millionaire playwright who goes back and forth between Germany and Hollywood. And he decides to write a screenplay, especially for her. And he is able to broker a deal with UFA, which is like the premier German cinema studio. So they give her this offer, And she says that she goes around and consults everyone's opinion to see what they think. And many tell her, don't do it. Like, if you leave Hollywood, no one will know who you are when you come back, and your career will be over. And she, says, well, I made up my mind and I decided I would go. And she's 23. The farthest she's ever been away is Canada. And not only that, as a Chinese American, she is restricted. Her movement is restricted. So she actually has to apply for permission every time she wants to leave the country. But she actually, from a researcher's perspective, it's great because I get all these documents that she has because she had to apply for permission. But she started to have that idea in 1927. She doesn't leave until 1928. So she goes to Berlin. Her older sister Lulu goes with her. They don't speak a word of German. And they have to kind of figure out which train to get on when they get off their boat. But she makes these really beautiful films with Richard Eichberg. And this is like the golden age of cinema in Germany during the Weimar era. So German expressionism, the films are just really beautiful, dramatic, kind of over the top. The lighting is incredible. So, people from Hollywood were going to Germany to study their techniques. And she makes these beautiful films, becomes this huge sensation in Berlin. Then she goes over to London, makes another film there called Piccadilly. And this is all during the silent era still. Becomes, again, another huge hit in England. People are there's a whole craze for Chinese things like embroidered coats. People are getting bangs. Yeah, exactly. There you go. What's old is new, and it never goes out of style. But yeah, she becomes this huge sensation, and then people back home start to realize, oh, well, did we let her go? And she was such a brilliant. She understood publicity so well. There's this. It's in the book. She gets some kind of offer from someone in Hollywood, and she basically has her letter in response printed in the newspaper. And says, oh, thank you so much for this offer. I don't think I'll be home in time for Christmas, so I can't do it. But I just made this film in Berlin and everyone loved it. And now I'm going to open a play on the West End in London. And she just, so she really blossoms in Europe because she's starring in all these films, right? Yeah. They're finally putting her front and center. And they're just these beautiful films. Pavement Butterfly actually recently just got restored. And there's a bootleg version on YouTube, which I highly recommend because these are her best films and most Americans have never seen them because they were not screened very much in the US.
Yeah, is there a place where people can see Anime Wong's work? Is a lot of it on YouTube now?
A lot of it is on YouTube. There's an amazing fan named Rebecca Grace Lee who runs the Gallery of Anime Wong on YouTube, and it's a channel just devoted to her films. So she's put up everything that she can put up without getting copyright strikes. Actually, a lot of her work is in public domain now, but I highly recommend because you can see all of the different eras. You can see silent sound. You can see a lot of her TV work as well, so there's a huge range of things to go through.
I love the story of how she started to do some theater while she was in Europe, but she was criticized because she spoke with an American accent. Yes. They weren't expecting because she'd been such a big star in silent film. So she goes and plays some parts in some plays, and she has this American accent, and they're just like appalled by that. Not a Chinese accent, but this American twangy accent.
Well, right. What even is a Chinese accent, right? If you speak English,
yeah.
But yeah, no, and that was an interesting thing that all through the silent era, even in her earliest Hollywood interviews, all the interviewers were they expected her to be from China. And there's this one great article, one of these articles that I think it's actually the epigraph in the book. The journalist gives all this space to say, oh, she looked like a Yuan Chen poem and like a Tang Dynasty vase or what, she's going on and on and on. And then she's like, and then she opened her mouth and ruined it all. But yes, in London, she was in this play that was supposed to be like it's a 12th century Chinese play that had been translated into German and then translated into English. And it was the first time it was being put on. And actually a young Laurence Olivier was in it. So there was Anime Wong and one other a Chinese actor, Rose Kwong. And then everyone else was white and yellow face. And the reviewer said, well, she's so lovely. She has this porcelain face and looks like a China doll, but then
And then she's like, get out of here.
Yeah.
It's so funny to me.
And the thing too, she takes in all this criticism, which is totally absurd, but she really listens to it. Like, she tries to do better. And so she actually pays for elocution lessons so that she can have like a British tinged accent, like a more of a transatlantic accent. So that's the voice that she has in all of her sound films. So I would love to know what her American accent has sounded like.
What it sounded like.
Yeah.
And she also learned how to speak German and French when she was living in Europe.
She learned how to speak German when she was in Germany, and then eventually she learned French because the first talkie film that she made was made in Europe through this collaboration between European studios, because they were basically trying to compete with America and distribute their films internationally, and which is why they wanted people from Hollywood to be in their films. And so her first talkie film, because they didn't do overdubbing, and this is the earliest version of the technology, she essentially made the film 3 times in 3 different languages with different actors. So not only did she make the transition to sound films, but she did it in 3 languages. Really
Incredible. So when did she start? What were the films where she was actually featured speaking?
Her first speaking film in Hollywood was Daughter of the Dragon. So this film was made in 1931, and now she's returned to the US triumphant, right? She actually, before she could even get to LA, she's getting off her ship in New York, and someone stops her while she's in line at customs saying, will you please be in this play called On the Spot, where there's a part for a Chinese woman? And she says, okay, fine. And so she delays getting to LA and does this, she has 2 weeks, she gets there and then she has 2 weeks to learn the lines before it opens on Broadway. And she opens it and it's a huge hit. And she ends up staying in New York for several months and then traveling the show all around the country. And then eventually gets to Los Angeles, where she now has a 2-picture deal with Paramount because they've realized their mistake. So they give her this, huge film to make where she's the star. It's called Daughter of the Dragon. She's the daughter of Fu Manchu. But unfortunately, they're falling into all the typical tropes of what an Asian actor could play. It has to be this fantastic, made up mythical world where she's this evil, temptress who's a daughter of an evil genius. And they even brought in Setsu Hayakawa to play. I guess they had one good Asian. they bring him back from Japan to play the detective who's trying to solve the case and falls in love with her, even though she's, a villain. And she does have these really beautiful costumes that Travis Banton designs for her. So it is, in that sense, it's a great film to watch just for the sets and the money that clearly went into it. But unfortunately, it's a terrible script. And the film doesn't do well. And so, my theory is essentially that the studio sees that it doesn't do well and then goes back to their old, their regular explanation that, well, Asians aren't box office. They don't sell movies. Nobody wants to see it. But it was actually just a bad film. It wasn't the actor's fault. And then after that, she does a film with Marlene Dietrich, Shanghai Express, and she's being directed by Joseph von Sternberg. And you can really tell that she exceeds under his direction. It's I will say it's her best Hollywood-made film, and that film was nominated for Oscars, but the supporting actress category did not exist at the time. So if it had, who knows if they would have nominated her, but she certainly would have deserved a nomination for that role. But that also, there's a whole thing with her and Marlene Dietrich, because previously they had met in Germany and they didn't. At that time, Anime Wong was the more famous actress, and now Marlene is in Hollywood and made into this huge star. And so the tables have kind of turned and they're in different positions. And it's really Marlene's vehicle, not Anime Wong's film. So her contract after that lapses and she's back on her own again.
There's a point in her life when she decides to go to China. Can you talk about why she went and what she experienced when she went to China?
Right. So she'd wanted to go to China for quite a while. Her family, she was supposed to go with her entire family several years before, but because of work, she ended up not being able to go. And then at the same time, there was all this big hoopla going around about this film called Good Earth, which is based on a best-selling book by Pearl Buck. And it's about Chinese farmers. And it's a very sympathetic, compelling story. Like half the country had read the book.
Yeah. Won the Pulitzer Prize, I think.
It did win a
Yeah.
Pulitzer, yeah. And then she also went on, the author Pearl Buck went on to win a Nobel Prize in literature. So it was this huge story. MGM was going to make, Irving Thalberg, the Boy Wonder, was going to make it into an epic film at MGM. And everyone in Hollywood was saying, well, who would they cast for the female lead? Should be Anime Wong, right? They make a show of trying to audition her. And what happens is the producer casts Paul Muni, Austrian-American actor, in the male lead. And so they use that as an excuse to say, well, we can't have a white actor playing opposite an Asian actor because that would be interracial mixing, even though they're both supposed to be playing Chinese people.
Yeah.
Right. So they say, sorry, we can't give you that role. So we give it to Louise Reiner, who just came from Germany, and her English is still so-so, but that's fine. Doesn't matter to us, even though like we're going to put all the Chinese actors through the ringer with, in terms of like how they speak English, or if they're Chinese enough or American or whatever. So they auditioned her for the secondary role. And you know, according to my research, they don't even offer her that role. They offer her a supporting role to that role. And so she creates a whole PR blitz. Again, this is her shrewdness, her ability to put things back in her control. And she just comes out and says, look, MGM wants me to play a role that's the only unsympathetic role in the entire film, because it was the second wife, tea house girl, who seduces the husband and marries him. So why am I, the Chinese actor, playing the unsympathetic role when we have all these white actors playing the leads? She says, I'm not going to do it. And in fact, not only am I not going to do it, but I'm going to take my first trip to China. So if you really want to know what China is like, then follow me. And she brings a documentary newsreel cameraman with her who documents all of her travels, makes it into a documentary. And she writes several articles for the New York Herald Tribune, which are syndicated across the country. And it becomes a life-changing trip for her, because she finally feels connected to her roots. And even though she ends up experiencing a lot of criticism from her, Chinese compatriots who have very high expectations for her, a lot of the criticism is not fair. But she takes it in stride, and she really listens to what they have to say, and starts to understand the importance of her role as an actress, that it's not just about her career anymore, that she unfortunately is a symbol, and she does represent Chinese people, Chinese Americans, China. I mean, that's unfortunately the situation for her at that time. And so when she comes back to the US, she says again, very boldly and very publicly, like, I'm not going to play any more unsympathetic roles. And she actually, rather than, you would think that she would get blackballed in Hollywood, that would just be the end of her career. But instead, she's able to finagle a new deal with Paramount. And she makes a series of films. They're B movies, so the stakes are lower, but she has more influence over them. And the first film she makes when she comes back is Daughter of Shanghai, where she's playing like the heroine crime. It's like a crime thriller where she's solving the case. And it's with Philip Ahn, her childhood friend, and they become the first Asian American actors to play a leading romantic role in the sound era. So she made history. I don't know if anyone noticed in 1937, like what she was doing, but it was actually pretty radical.
And how would you say that trip to China just changed how she saw herself in America as an actress?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's two parts to it. It's one, being more connected to her Chinese roots.
Yeah.
Because, being a Chinese American in that era, there wasn't a term, people didn't call you Chinese American, and much less Asian American, right? Those terms didn't exist. So to understand where she came from, where she had been told that she came from and had never been, I think it was a deeply meaningful thing for her. There's actually, so the documentary that she made, the footage is held at UCLA, the television archive.
Have you seen it, by the way?
I have. Yeah, it's beautiful. I really wish that it could be digitized and shared more widely. There's maybe about 5 minutes of it that are on YouTube. But the part that was so impactful to me was when she goes to her father's village in Toisan, which is in southern China, and she's walking arm in arm with him, and you see like the bamboo groves, and there's the rice fields, and it's just a beautiful moment that she finally gets to see where she's from, where her family is from. So I think that just she carried that with her when she came back to Hollywood. And so in her early career, she had, again, played all these stereotypes and oftentimes was wearing very skimpy outfits.
Yeah.
So she stopped wearing those. She wouldn't even wear a sarong. One of her films, they said, we want you to wear a sarong. She's like, Chinese girls don't wear sarongs. So she refused to do that. And she also, while she was in China, she ran into her friend Warner Oland, who actually became very famous for playing Charlie Chan. He was a Swedish actor, but for whatever reason, I mean, they said that he looked Chinese and without doing very much. And so when he goes to China, everyone loves him because they love Charlie Chan, because they see that as a positive role model. And which seems so unfair, right? The white guy goes to Asia and then everyone loves him. And me, I get, everyone complains about my work. So when she goes back to Hollywood, she's like, well, why can't I play a female version of Charlie Chan, right? Why can't I do a female detective? And so you kind of see that pattern through the rest of her films with Paramount. And then later when she has a television series in the 50s called The Gallery of Liu Song, which is her Chinese name. And she's solving mysteries as a heroine. There's even a film where she's a astrologist and she solves the murders by reading everyone's horoscope. So she came up with quite a few creative ideas.
Yeah. I want to open this up for questions, but the last thing I want to ask you, Katie, is when we first started this conversation, you said, I had no idea how famous she was. And this book is an example. And you write so beautifully, give so many examples of how famous she was. Why do you think that the story of Anime Wong has been, I don't know, we just don't know it. Like we don't know it like we know the stories of Marlene Dietrich and so many of these other actresses from the 20s and 30s. Why isn't her name rolling off the tongue like others are? Others still do.
I mean, I think it comes down to who's telling the story that really matters. And if the people who are in control of storytelling, whether it's mainstream media or films or books, don't care about her story, then it doesn't get told. And that is really what happened for the last, many decades. I mean, that was another part of like researching her story, but then learning that there were so many other Asian Americans in early Hollywood. It was like, well, how come no one is talking about that either? But there weren't the establishment in Hollywood. They had that wasn't part of their agenda to tell that story, right? That wasn't something they cared about. And then, there's other things to take into consideration. I mean, the fact that she dies in 1961, the beginning of the 60s, which is a very tumultuous decade. And a lot of that's when the term Asian American is coined. And a lot of people during that time felt that her work and other people's work from the earlier generation was damaging to the image of Asian Americans. They kind of blamed her for these stereotypes. So in that sense, that's another reason perhaps why her legacy was forgotten, because people actively did not want to talk about her.
Yeah. I mean, it is astounding, again, how famous she was, how much critical press that she got, how she spent her life socially, but yet we are now just learning through incredible writers like you about this illustrious life. And again, this power that she had in creating this path for herself, which is so impressive. I'd love to now open it up to questions to all of you, if you have any of Katie.
I got a question.
Yeah.
As you were talking about this, I was going to ask you, how much time did you spend at NARA? And not, National
NARA?
Archives?
Well, I started researching this during the pandemic. So I didn't get to go there in person.
Go there,
but I requested the files for her entire family. So, and the funny thing is that I have some files for my own family, but I haven't actually looked at them because I'm so busy looking at her files. Yeah, and if you guys don't know, that it's the National Archives. So that's where, and what I requested from them were all of the papers documenting like her family's identities and every time they came and left the country, because when you came back, you were interrogated. And even Anime Wong, you know, famous movie star, still had to go through that process every single time she came in and out.
That raises the question. I mean, this is a very lengthy bibliography. Tell us about the process of researching. I mean, this is such a comprehensive book.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to, well, you know, thankfully there were other biographers, so I had a starting point. At least I could start with their citations and the materials they looked at. So I made sure to look at everything digitized, so you don't have to like go to a newspaper archive and go through every single newspaper. You can just type in a keyword. So I did a lot of digital archive clippings and movie magazines. I spoke to as many people as I could who were still alive, who knew her, or descendants of people who knew her. So unearthed a lot of interesting stories that way. Looked at her personal correspondence, which is at Yale. And then I realized, oh, I should look at her friends' correspondence to each other and see what they said about her. So that yielded some really interesting results. And then, yeah, I mean, there's so many different, I spent probably a month at the Academy Library just going through production files from all the different films that she'd been involved in, to see the press releases, the things that, how did they spin her? And even, you know, looking at Flower Drum Song, which she was supposed to be in and died several weeks before rehearsals began. And one of the interesting things I found there was a press release about the party they had to launch production. And there was no mention of anime at all. I mean, she had already passed at that point, but it wasn't even mentioned that, you know,
wow, she was
how sad this person died. And I think they just, I don't know. So, but there were a lot of interesting things like that. But my attitude was like, leave no stone unturned.
You've kind of become an honorary member of the Wong family. I know Anna Wong, May Wong's niece, is somewhere in the room. She's back there. And in fact, this is Santa Monica is where Anime Wong lived. In fact, Katie was saying that this probably would have been her local bookstore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Can you talk more about the style? You said there was this other book that was kind of gave you an idea for how you want to approach this.
Sure.
And how you see this distinct from other kinds of biographies.
Questions about the style for those in the back and how this is distinctive from other biographies.
Right. Well, the funny thing is, people, when I first started writing the book, people would always ask me, so is it a biography? And I'd say, well, I guess, because I just knew I had to write about Anime Wong. I didn't realize I was writing a biography, and so in that sense, it's not a traditional biography. I do cover a lot of her life. I don't cover everything, but it's not always meant to be relentlessly chronological, like this happened, this happened, this happened. It's meant to be narrative driven. Yeah. I wanted it to be more in the vein of creative nonfiction, where you're really focused on the narrative beats of the story. And as you know, and as the author, that comes down to as I see it. So in that sense, it's narrative driven. It's also meant to be very immersive and, you know, sort of cinematic. I wanted, and this was selfishly too, I wanted to be the fly on the wall in her life. I wanted to see how fun and glamorous it could be. And I wanted other people to be able to experience that. So it's meant to be as if you're sitting back and watching it unfold.
Yeah. And it's so beautifully done. Anyone else have any questions?
I would ask you, it's so in everything you've talked about, thank you. I would ask you, you started off talking about how, well, just basically like, what did you learn about yourself in studying her?
Right.
You know,
question is, what did Katie learn about herself in studying Anime Wong?
It's a great question. I try to tackle it a little bit in the preface to the book, but basically learning about Anime Wong was a way of learning about my own history. And that's one of the reasons I was drawn to her, because she was third generation Chinese American. I'm fifth generation. My family has been here for quite a while. Again, from Los Angeles. So there was a lot of crossover from the same place in Southern China. So I was like, whoa, she's just like me, or like my mom, or, you know, she's like my family. And so learning about her life was a way of learning about my own history. And I think I found that I was also, in a way, trying to follow in her footsteps in certain aspects and be cosmopolitan and travel the world and have a interesting and creative life. And, when I talked about the documentary of her time in China, when she goes to visit her father's ancestral village, it kind of brought me to tears, because when I watched it for the first time, because only a couple of years prior, I went to visit my grandma's village and the house that she grew up in southern China, which actually no longer exists. It's been bulldozed now. But to know that we had these similar experiences in common was really meaningful.
And I would also just add to that, as a Chinese American myself, I mean, I didn't learn anything about Asian American history in school. I went through my entire educational life without learning about the contributions of a single Asian American to the United States. So to learn about this life that Anime Wong lived and how prolific a career she had, it almost makes me angry that it was covered up, that these stories have been so buried. Because again, we've heard so much about the other actors and actresses of this period, but so little until now about Anime Wong. In the back?
While you're talking at that point, I have a question for both of you. Why her story has been buried so deeply? Is it something to do with her family that didn't want it to go to like, oh, because I read another book recently, The Morning Star, by Gail, also from Beijing.
Mhm.
And it's like a historical fiction, but in the first person, telling the story. And I'm trying to figure out, like, after so many years, this has been buried or hidden. Is it partially because possibly the family is not feeling very proud, or they're trying to not to expose much of the material?
I mean, I think there was some feeling in the family that they wanted to respect her privacy, because they felt there was a lot of bad media around her in her day. So I'm definitely sensitive to that. But there's also, I think, one of the reasons you see all these books coming out now, and a biopic and The Quarter and the Barbie, is because things are changing in Hollywood. It's a reflection of what's going on now. I mean, when I sold the book 5 years ago, I only had one offer because the other publishers doubted that she was even worthy of a biography. So things have changed very quickly. The attitudes towards her story have changed very quickly. But I think that has to do with what's going on. I mean, you have Crazy Rich Asians. Now you have like so many different Asian American led projects, and people are starting to wonder, well, what's our history, right?
Yeah.
Because who was there before us? And it's Anime Wong.
And I do think, and this is just my own opinion, but I think that the attacks on the Asian community during COVID came with this recognition in the media that Asian stories have been really marginalized, and Asians in the media have been caricaturized, or very rarely had leading roles. And so I think over the years there has been this effort to dig into history that frankly belongs to all of us. We might call it Asian American history, but this history belongs to all of us. But there has been an effort to dig into more diverse American stories, whether they're about high profile Asian Americans or other communities. I mean, I definitely think that there has been this kind of awakening in the wake of COVID.
Oh, I think in the very back, Jen? Yeah, you, Jen. Sorry.
What have the responses to your book been like from Asian American actors in the industry today?
Well, they're still reading the book.
It just came out. Yeah.
But I will say I hosted a screening last week of Daughter of Shanghai there were a lot of actors and people in the film industry there. And it was such a pleasure for me because they really enjoyed the film. And so many of them said, well, I know about Anime Wong, but I've never watched any of her films. And it kind of crystallized for them her talent, but also her commitment. And that was the first film she made when she came back from China. So that was really validating, I guess, in a way, because I watched these films by myself. So to watch it with a whole room full of people, I don't know how they're going to react to it. I don't know if they're going to think it's old and boring or, what, but people really enjoyed it. So I loved that.
There's another question here.
So I know you said she didn't want to be like her mom. It seemed like she was sort of a trailblazer. Were there any female mentors or role models or people, Asian American women or women that were championing her career at that time? Or was she just really doing it on her own, navigating it all?
Yeah, she was kind of on her own. I mean, I think she definitely looked up to other actresses in Hollywood. So probably Mary Pickford. I mean, Mae Murray was one of her favorite actors growing up. And Mary Pickford was married to Douglas Fairbanks, who she'd been in Doug's film, and she had a autographed picture from both of them in her bungalow. So I certainly think she looked to other people in Hollywood to see how they went about their own careers, but she was very unlike other actresses in that she never really had the same studio treatment where they made her into something. I mean, certainly there were probably PR people who tried to pitch certain stories, but she was kind of on her own, and she relied on her family because her family became a part of her team. Like her sister Lulu was companion, but also sometimes secretary and manager. One of her brothers would help her with scripts or act as her chauffeur. I mean, they kind of filled in wherever they needed. And her other sister, Mary, was her double on set. So, I mean, they were all involved. And so she didn't have like a stage parent, right, who was telling her what to do. She was self-guided, that's one of the other incredible things about it, right? She had such poise and vision for herself.
In the back.
I'm so curious when you were saying that you also read letters between her friends and talked about her. Was there anything you discovered? Like, I'm just curious if her contemporaries in Hollywood understood how totally flattened and two-dimensionalized she was, and just kind of accepted like that's just how it is, or did they feel enraged about it and fume about it to each other or anything like that?
Well, the friends that I'm thinking of were actually not actors. And I can tell you about what was in the letters. But I will say that she had a lot of friends who were journalists. She was a favorite among the press pool in Hollywood. They were all in her corner. So they would write pieces about, why did they have this white actress in Yellowface when Anime Wong could have played it? Or why didn't they think of her for The Good Earth? Or how did they let her slip through their fingers yet again and she's off to Europe? So she had a lot of people in her corner writing these stories that would criticize Hollywood's behavior and attitude towards her. And so I quote from them pretty liberally in the book. There's some really juicy ones. And then as far as the letters go, the ones that I looked at were between her friends, Bernadine Sold Fritz, who was kind of a salon hostess who also very cosmopolitan. They became very good friends in China. Who was also friends with Fania Marinoff, the wife of Carl Van Vechten, who had, decades-long correspondence with anime. So Fania and Bernadine in the 1950s would kind of compare notes on what was going on in anime's life at that time. And it was a difficult period of her life, certainly, because she was trying to figure out what to do. And it was a little bit before she made her comeback in film. So there were some not very nice things that they said about her, actually. And this is also when she was struggling with alcoholism and her health and her beauty had faded. She couldn't play the same parts as she did previously. So the funny thing is this is a letter I found like on the last hour of the last day that I was at this archive. And I had to continue, like, it's so hard to read because it's handwritten. So I had to decipher it on the train home. But it was very brutal. They're basically saying like, why can't she accept that she's old now? And she's not the young actress that she was. And And then there was a line that was really, harsh. Basically, Fania, who was also an actress, said, "For she had no talent," which kind of shows some of the jealousy that they harbored towards her because she had been very successful. So it was interesting to see some of those comments. I mean, sometimes your friends say the harshest things about you.
Anyone else?
I wonder, how did you come up with the name of the book? What is the name of the book mean to you?
So it's a bit of a riff on I'm Not Your Negro, which is the Raoul Peck documentary of James Baldwin. And it's also a phrase that James Baldwin said. So it was kind of in my head from having seen that documentary. And with the book, I wanted to reframe the narrative that gets told about her and give her back the agency that she always had, because so much of how her story is told is as tragedy. Oh, poor her, look at all these terrible things that happened to her. And then, her career ended, after she didn't get this one part. And I don't really see her life as a tragedy. I mean, certainly there were tragic aspects to it, but she always rose above it. And so I wanted to give her back her power. And so Not Your China Doll is, a way to kind of defy the stereotypes that were projected onto her. And one of the other interesting things was that during the pandemic, having gone to some of these Stop Anti-Asian Hate rallies, I noticed that a lot of women were carrying signs that said, "I'm not your China doll." And so I think that phrase itself is also a stand-in for a way that a lot of Asian American women feel about how they're perceived in society.
Do you think that notion plagued her throughout her life?
Yes, I mean,
and do you think she really ever overcame it?
Well, I think that her personality is so, as we were talking earlier, she's so bold and so independent that she, in that sense, she overcame it because she was never a China doll, right? That was only something she played on screen,
right?
But certainly the fact that she was exoticized and wanted because of the way she looked, I think it was harder later in her career to accept that she didn't look that way anymore. And that's also just a part of fame and celebrity and aging, which people hadn't. I mean, another thing people don't realize is she's part of like a first class of Hollywood celebrities. No, people weren't famous like that before. And they also hadn't experienced the come down of, aging and what that could look like. So it was a really difficult thing to go through.
Some things never change, right? Sadly. Anyone else? Let's do this. 2 more in the back. Sorry. Go ahead.
You spoke a bit about your experience researching, but what about your personal experience in writing your first book? Was it just a straight path, like you knew what you were going to do and just hammered it out, or were there some winding roads and roadblocks along the way?
It definitely was not a straight path. As I mentioned earlier, I started researching it during the pandemic, so it meant I couldn't go anywhere, so I could only do things I could do from home. And then you have life events that happen that make it really difficult to write a book. So there were a couple of those. But generally, it was like fits and starts, because the great thing about a book like this is you get to do such fun, deep research, and you're like learning new things constantly, which is, I thrive on that. But the other part is that, well, eventually you're supposed to write something. You can't just keep doing research. So you have to figure out a balance between the two. And in the end, what did that for me was having a deadline. When I knew the book was due, I wrote the second half of the book like straight in 6 months because I had to.
The question in the back.
Would you say that her career was more successful in Europe than in Hollywood? And why do you think that is?
Yes, her career was definitely, it was more successful in Europe. They were more embracing of her. I mean, they gave her lead roles. They were willing to give her the spotlight in a way that Hollywood was not. And the reception was very good. And I think that has to do with I mean, just certain, I mean, the culture at the time. So, I mean, it's hard to understand now how coded life was depending on your race, like 100 years ago, but it really was. And so racism was really deeply entrenched in this country. And one of the reasons, so there's a whole section on Paul Robeson, who she was friends with. And unfortunately, I don't know a ton more about their relationship, but I felt it was important to include his story in the book because through him, you also see what it was like to be a Black entertainer, which was even harder than, you know, what Anna May went through. And like, for example, when he was doing a play in the West Village in New York City, there wasn't anywhere he could go to eat. No one would serve him in a cafe or a restaurant. So he'd have to go to Grand Central or to Harlem. And can you imagine like living that way where you're not welcome in most places? So Europe was not, you know, Europe has the luxury of having, you know, caused all of these things that happened in the US, but not being responsible for it, right? So they didn't have the same social strictures, and, you know, even interracial marriage was not illegal in Europe. So they were much more open-minded, but they also weren't as diverse. So they didn't have contact with people from other races or other countries. So in that sense, Anime Wong and Paul Robeson and Josephine Baker were these novelties. They were still exoticized, but in a more positive way, if that makes sense.
Last question, anyone? Well, my last question, you know, as we've been talking about, this book is just, it's so well researched. I imagine you probably feel like you know Anime Wong better than you know most people at this point. Is there anything that you are still curious about in the course of, you know, what you've learned? Is there anything still that you might not have been able to answer definitively?
Right. I would love to read her love letters because I'm sure she was a very prolific writer. So I know that there must have been correspondence between so many people she had relationships. The one in particular I'm most interested in was Eric Mashwitz, who was this British composer and writer. And he wrote the song, These Foolish Things, for her. It's about her. I think in the song, he talks about, you know, these telegrams that they would send across the Atlantic, and I'd just love to know what was in them.
Yeah. And last question, if you were to recommend the top 3 Anime Wong films or shows, what would you suggest to our audience to kind of get a real sense of her?
It's so hard to limit myself to 3. I would say Pavement Butterfly, which I mentioned was recently restored, that was made in Germany, and it's on YouTube. So that is definitely one of her top 5 films. So I would recommend that. It's a great silent film. Shanghai Express still holds up. I mean, even though she's not the star, she's great in it. It's a fabulous film. And then I would suggest either Daughter of Shanghai or King of Chinatown, which is one of the films she made with Paramount when she came back from China.
Fantastic. Katie Gee Salisbury, everyone. Thank you so much. This is so wonderful. Are you signing tonight too? Okay, great. So Kate,
After Kate's mistake sign. Thank you so much.
is this